Bro, does Powerman even play video games? I mean, just look at his channel, man. I mean, all it's talking about is Smash character roster discussion and PC parts. So back in 2019, it was actually pretty bad for me as a gamer when it came to beating games and playing new games, because I swear, 90% of the time, I was just playing either Smash Bros. Ultimate or Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate. So in order to reconcile that, I made a New Year's resolution to myself for 2020 that I would beat one game a month at least. And you know what? It's actually worked out pretty well for me so far. I'm actually a little bit further ahead of what I set my goal as. Now, why I made this video specifically is actually I've been recording a lot of gameplay of stuff I've played through my capture card on my computer, and I need a reason to use the footage. Now, I know what I'm playing right now videos are the most stereotypical, easy gaming YouTuber content, but I actually want to give a crack at this format and at least try to make a video like that. Now, some of these games I might go further in depth about than what I'm going to talk about here in potential future videos, but we're not going to worry about that right now. Now, I'm going to mention that unless I otherwise say so, or the game literally doesn't even exist on this console, I played almost all of these games on the Nintendo Switch. So a lot of the multi-plats I'm going to be talking about here, it's specifically going to be the Switch version, so that might influence how I talk about these games a little bit. Now, I'm also going to give a spoiler warning here. I'm not going to try to deliberately spoil people. I'm going to try to use like early game footage and stuff with as little story specific stuff as possible. But given I didn't have a lot of the footage for early game stuff for some of these games, I'm going to try my best to kind of work around that. But just be aware that you might see stuff in the B-roll over here that you might necessarily have wanted to have seen. Okay, blah, 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 whatever. But let's actually start talking about games. So starting back in January, I really dedicated myself to finish Trials of Mana, which I had started back in November of 2019. No, it wasn't the remake. The remake hadn't come out until about like the end of April, but oh boy, the original game is really something else. I mean, I have played my fair share of JRPGs, from Pokemon to Dragon Quest to Final Fantasy to Persona, so obviously this game wasn't out of my territory. But what was the fact that it was a Super Nintendo RPG, which I really didn't have any experience with prior to playing Trials of Mana. Now, Trials of Mana is kind of a legendary game in that people on the internet would go around and proclaim that it was the best JRPG that the West had never gotten. And I kind of wanted to see what all the hype was about and to support the Mana series by purchasing this collection. And now that I've beaten the game, it's alright. Now don't get me wrong, the art style and the music and kind of the overall atmosphere is really like peak Squaresoft from that time period. But at the same time though, I don't know, the combat felt a little bit too shallow for me for how long the game was. And wow, this game is quite massive and ambitious for an SNES game. In fact, so ambitious, I actually kind of was getting tired of playing the game because I expected the game to end at what was actually the halfway point. And that's just me playing through one playthrough with one particular set of characters. See, Trials of Mana is not just ambitious in that it's a really long-ass game, but also the story and bosses actually change depending on which party grouping that you pick at the start of the game. Now, I could just sit here and say, well, I got to the end credits, so I must have beat the game, but did I? Really? For as long as the game is, I didn't really feel like there was enough for me to really learn about the combat by the time the game was done and not make me feel kind of bored and really feel like I mastered the game. From about like 60% of the way into the game until the last 2 or 3 bosses, there was a big dead zone where I didn't feel like I was really like improving my combat skills, and there wasn't really anything that the game was giving me to make me improve my combat skills. Now, in my playthrough, I used Durin, Angela, and Kevin, and I'm sorry I didn't look up gay guys beforehand, so this is probably not the most optimal team layout between the Angela and Durin storyline that I had chosen. Now, Durin was great. He was a sword fighter, range and, being able to cut things and stuff. Kevin, he had a fun, like, night werewolf thing going on, so his power increased at night. That was fun, too. But Angela just was really frustrating to have as a party member, because at least what I noticed is that maybe just the particular class path I had chosen, but for the first half of the game, she has so fucking few spells to use that pretty much most of the time your best option was to use her staff just to hit enemies instead of actually casting spells. The thing that she's actually good at. But I will say that her regular attack stat didn't make her as useless as like Aerith in Final Fantasy VII, but still, it wasn't playing to the character's strengths. Now, I'm glad I played the game, and it was fun, and I enjoyed my time with it, but I feel like kind of its quality was kind of oversold to me. And, I feel like I'm kind of forgiving with JRPGs a little bit because I like experimenting with different combat systems and the potential of that, and I love being sucked into and immersed in like a JRPG world. But I can imagine somebody who was told the same thing I was, who maybe wasn't necessarily as forgiving, just very easily dropping this game very early on. So I do like Trials of Mana, but I wouldn't say that it would be enough that I would be willing to go back and start a new playthrough with the other characters and go through all that different content of the story and the different villains and stuff.
A great slam and then it's on.
Now, the next game I beat in 2020 was Cuphead on the Switch back in February, and I gotta say, that is some Kino action platformer gameplay if I've ever seen it. It just really throws me back to those early Mega Man X games and just how hard they were and how punishing they were. But at the same time, though, they were fair and really pushed the limits of your skill with every single boss and every single encounter. Now, the art style of this game is pretty much perfect, right? 1930s Fleischer style. They really go crazy with all the different designs and crazy things that all the characters can do and animate like. But to be honest, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of that art style. But at the same time, though, I appreciate the way Cuphead does it, where they design the characters in such a way that it can more broadly appeal to people who don't necessarily already like that art style in the first place. And God, I can't even imagine the animations, how long it took for them to draw them and figure out in the process, okay, how do we make this very gamey, but also at the same time adhere to kind of the animation principles of the era. Now, one of the most interesting artistic things about Cuphead is just that the game itself actually runs at 60 frames per second, but the actual characters are animated at 24. Yeah, that's a little odd. The best way I could describe it to people is that the actual movement of the character on the screen is the smoothness that 60 FPS provides, but the actual actions that the characters take have that animation-like frame rate. Now, as a result, it kind of creates this odd look of things that are moving, looking a little bit out of place from what the time would be like, especially when you're going up vertical stages. Oh yeah, that's like a little bit uncanny. Another minor complaint I have that's kind of related to the art is the foregrounds. Now again, the foregrounds look great, but the problem is that they block your ability to see your player character and what attacks are incoming. And so for a game that 99% of the time, death is your fault, it's totally fair that you died from that thing, right? The foregrounds create this one exception of, oh, this felt like a cheap death, when it really shouldn't have been. And there's 3 stages in the game that have this particular problem, but oh my god, the robot boss has that foreground problem the fucking worst, because that boss is especially annoying and is such like a random difficulty spike compared to the rest of the bosses on that specific aisle. And even compared to the penultimate boss, he still feels a little bit too hard. I mean, just look at how much crap he's throwing at you, and it's not even halfway into the boss fight. I think it's inevitable that people get really pissed off playing Cuphead, especially for a first-time playthrough. But I actually was like relatively calm for like the first like 40-50% of the game, but it was so frustrating, like that second half. Like I didn't throw a controller or anything, but it just made me go like, oh my god, now I fucking get it. So yeah, I don't know what I could just say about Cuphead that already hasn't been said, or hasn't been said in a better way. So I'm just hoping that that DLC that comes out, it continues the difficulty curve from the base game, because I always love when DLC does that, when they take sort of what already was there and then expands further upon it and increases the difficulty curve. And throughout March and April, I had played the beloved classics Doom 1 and Doom 2. I actually find it incredibly surprising how playable these games still are today, for being games that came out in the mid-90s on PC when there was no mouse support for either of these games initially. How could a game that old feel so good on a modern dual analog stick controller? But it just works. If I didn't know about the actual age of Doom 1 and 2 and you had told me that, oh, this is just some experimental pixel art indie game FPS that was designed for controller use that came out in the past couple years, I would have believed you. One of the most surprising things, though, that doesn't actually relate to the gameplay of the game is that Doom 1 and 2 on the Switch support HD Rumble. What? Yeah, out of all the Switch games that have come out so far, that a modern port of the older Doom games that run on Unity engine, that had a mandatory BethesdaNet login when they launched, that, oh yeah, that's gonna have the best use of HD Rumble outside of Nintendo's own games. Each weapon has its own unique firing effect that feels very different from each other, and really makes the game feel a lot more textured and varied as you're going through the game when you're switching weapons. Now, the coolest HD rumble effect that I liked from both of these games was the chainsaw. And when you're using it on an enemy, it actually feels like there's two little like mini chainsaw blades inside the controller that are spinning. And that's really cool. Now this added effect really kind of dissuaded me from using my PowerA wireless controller, even though I think it actually works pretty well for Doom, all things considered, that because it lacked rumble and the Pro Controller did that, I could never fully tear myself away from the Pro Controller because it just adds this whole other thing to the game. And speaking of the actual gameplay itself, my God, this game feels really smooth. And you know what? It's not surprising that the original Doom games are still popular today because it gives you a sort of level of freedom and speed of your movement that not a lot of games then, and a lot of games now, still don't give you. And so if you can really figure out how to not run into stuff, this game can feel really, really good. Now, between the two games, I prefer Doom 2 more, and you might be saying, well, no duh, it's a sequel, but I just find the Doom 1 levels, you know, they're good, but at the same time, though, they feel a little, like, formulaic. Like, I don't know, once I got done playing that game, and then I played Doom 2, Doom 2's level design feels a little bit more natural, and it feels a little bit more interesting in sort of what it's asking you to do, and what sorts of challenges it throws in your way. Whereas it feels like in Doom 1, they kind of had a specific set of goals that every level needed to achieve. And so they kind of had to, you know, kind of section each of those levels off. It's like, okay, this level, you know, this part does this thing, and this part does that thing. Whereas Doom 2, you might have just a whole level of combat encounters where all you just got to do is just kill all these enemies, and then some of the levels might be more exploration based. Even though on a mechanical level, I don't think Doom 1 and Doom 2 are that much different from each other, aside from the super shotgun in 2, that it feels like the level design of Doom 2 takes more advantage of the systems that were present in Doom 1 in creating sort of a different and unique feeling experience. Ooh, and oh boy, we haven't even gotten to the mods yet. I mean, it's actually incredible the value that both of these ports have. That, okay, there's a fair amount of levels and stuff, you know, you get your $5, but there's all these other additional levels that you can go through that are free. All you just need is a BethesdaNet sign-in. Like, for $5, that's an amazing value. Man, they're really hard, to be, let's just be honest. They're really hard. Like, even with save states and stuff, like, you don't lose all your weapons, you just reload your save. Like, they're still really hard. But at the same time, though, these are some, like, really good levels. Like, this is some really, really good stuff. And it's, like, it really makes me, like, actually want to learn and get better at the game in order to beat these levels. Like, they are so good, and I don't think that you should pass playing any of these levels up when you buy the game. Now, I am taking a break from playing both games at the moment just because even though I haven't finished all the levels that you could possibly download, I'm kind of a little bit sick of playing the games. Like, it's just kind of like I need something different. Right, they're all great levels, but at a certain point, it's just like, oh God, there's just so much. And so I do intend, though, to go back and try to beat all of the additional levels that you can download for Doom 1 and 2.
Alfred, run analysis on the blood sample I just uploaded.
Right you are, Master Bruce. I'm searching for possible matches now. How you managed to get this sample is beyond me, sir.
Batman Arkham Knight. Oh boy. This game, you know, is a controversial game among the gaming community, isn't it? Ah yes, what a nice amount of escapism that I can play a game where I observe a major city that is being actively destroyed and looted by criminals, and the police are so under-equipped that they can barely do anything about it. Now this seems like a very love it or hate it kind of game, which is weird considering that the previous Arkham games were pretty much universally beloved. Now I know the reason that this game is so divisive is because of the Batmobile stuff. Now, driving in the Batmobile is pretty cool, but actually it's a pretty important part of the game because you can turn it into a tank and fight other tanks. And actually it's a pretty significant portion of the main story that you engage in these tank-on-tank encounters. Now I actually liked a lot of the tank mechanics, and it's interesting how you have to do some trade-offs for certain upgrades and stuff, and what you can do with a tank I actually found interesting. But when it came down to the actual battles and stuff, what really kind of ruined it is that there's so few, like, enemy types in the game that basically the difference between combat encounters kind of devolved into how many enemies that we can throw at you at once. I mean, most of the encounters in the game featured at least 20 tanks, and like 70% of them were just the basic ass grunt tank that went down in one hit. And contrast this with sort of the other enemies that Batman fights, both in the hand-to-hand combat and the stealth stuff. The game really loves throwing curveballs at you and really sort of forcing you to learn new scenarios constantly, whether it be with stealth, where you can't use detective mode sometimes, or there being medics, or with the hand-to-hand combat, where they sometimes throw ninjas in, or they give, you know, certain enemies certain weapons that you hadn't seen before, throwing in some brutes. And then you look at the tank combat, and it's just this kind of like this curve of, okay, how many more tanks can we throw at the player? And then it just being the vast majority of them being the same type of tank. See, what I would have preferred instead is that instead of having like just the amount of tanks just increase absurdly by the end of the game, maybe they should have instead have done like the harder types of tanks, you know, the ones that do the 3-shot, the missile launches and stuff, instead of just throwing like 40 grunts at you and then 10 of a certain other kind and 10 of another kind. And speaking of the Batmobile, oh boy, this game is quite massive, and that you could really tell that they had to accommodate for the Batmobile in its design. I feel a little split on the world design though, because on one hand, I do really appreciate how much effort went into this, and it does really feel like a city, but at the same time though, having everything accommodate the Batmobile, it kind of like really takes away sort of the like on-foot presence of Batman. Like, at least in my playthrough, I barely went down to the actual like surface streets at all. Like, maybe to like get some info from like Riddler informants, but like nothing else. But the big problem that this game has that Arkham City or Arkham Asylum didn't really have either, they still didn't fix in the third Rocksteady game, was you don't really have one-on-one hand-to-hand combat boss fights. You know, for a game series that's been touted as, you know, you are the Batman and you live the experience of Batman, it's missing one of the most fundamental things about the Batman experience, which is sometimes you just gotta like straight up like fight a dude one-on-one. And the Arkham combat system, don't get me wrong, I love it a lot, but you can clearly tell it was designed for multiple enemies in mind, right? Just from the flow to the takedowns to the combo meter, it pretty much doesn't really work and breaks when you try to have a one-on-one boss fight. And this is where I really appreciate Spider-Man PS4, that it's kind of the spiritual successor to the Arkham games. And that game is built in such a way that it has really enjoying and satisfying one-on-one boss encounters. And so, for me, going from playing Spider-Man PS4 to back to playing Arkham Knight, it just feels like something's missing there. Now, is this the best Batman Arkham game? Well, first of all, I haven't played Batman Arkham Origins, so I can't make that definitive statement. But from my memories of playing City and Asylum, probably not. Now, I talk all this shit about this game, but I actually really do like this game, that it does have the really fun and enjoyable Batman Arkham stuff in it that's really high quality. And it's just that this game in particular, they still didn't fix a lot of the fundamental flaws the series had. And they just tacked on stuff that wasn't nearly as high quality as the rest of the stuff in the game. But at the same time, though, I get to really appreciate how much effort went into this game and how they really tried their best to both expand what Batman Arkham was, but at the same time kind of subvert it to not just be another Batman Arkham game. And I think this is actually really smart because it's Rocksteady acknowledging that the player base has kind of figured out the average Batman Arkham encounter, right? Like, they can change the level design, they can throw in more enemies, but at the end of the day, if they didn't do all these things, that they know the average player has pretty much figured out a Batman Arkham encounter by now.
I don't need to tell you what this is, right?
Of course not. It's healing materia.
You can have it for saving my life.
Just doing my job, nothing more.
Yeah. Fact is, I'm lucky you were there.
Survival can be a matter of luck or skill. And you can't rely on luck.
And in June, I beat Final Fantasy VII Remake. And the original too, but I find the remake more interesting to talk about in a video like this, and I want to do more stuff about the original and the remake. I can't believe that people think that this game is actually garbage. This game, out of all remakes, this game people are having meltdowns about. This one. Now, there's so much I could talk about this game with, but I just want to specifically focus on the combat system and how great I think it is, and how much potential it could have. Now, this definitely is a real-time combat system, but I would argue the game's much more defined by the stagger system the enemies have, where in order to do massive amounts of damage on the bosses, or just do a ton more damage on like the lower level enemies, that you need to build stagger so that way they're vulnerable and they stop attacking and stuff. And so a lot of your combat decisions are gonna be trying to stagger the enemy. And for such a simple idea, the game really gets a ton out of just trying to force you to stagger the enemies as much as possible while not entirely being about that. Okay, maybe not all the bosses were that richly complex. Definitely the Hell House was annoying and its only goal was to just stagger it. And I actually really like the party system in this game, not just playing as the other characters besides Cloud, but actually how you switch between them I think is pretty fun. And I know a lot of people give shit to the party system that the AI is kind of crap, in that the characters don't necessarily avoid AoE attacks that are obviously coming, or they're not the wisest users of ATB gauge. But at the same time, though, the game is not really designed to have, like, the computer AI operate your allies, like, 24/7. But when you get to hard mode, you kind of realize that the most optimal way to play the game is to constantly switch between all the characters, right? As soon as you activate the ability of one character, you want to switch to another character, build their ATB gauge, maybe use their triangle ability in the process, activate an ability, and then switch to another character that doesn't have anything charged yet. I don't know another way to describe this, but it feels like kind of the momentum of battle is kind of carried between characters when you learn this. And so when you have someone like Cloud who might get hit and take a ton of damage, and you switch to Aerith, that kind of kills the momentum for everybody else that Cloud is hurt. But if you're doing well in combat, everybody is doing well generally, and not just one individual character. Now, I haven't re-beat the entire game on hard mode. I've just been going to chapter select and playing individual chapters on hard. Although I've been playing a lot of the late game chapters on hard mode, the majority of them. So I can say, at least with a little bit of like a knowledgeable opinion, what optimal play should look like. And so when I look at this combat system, I do see its problems, but at the same time, I do see a lot of potential in the next couple games and with other party members and things they could go with it. And it's kind of sad, though, that the guy who developed the combat system, I believe it's the same guy who made the Kingdom Hearts 2 combat system, his name was dropped off the project, I think like 6 months before this game came out, which is kind of sad. Now, this current game is no Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix in terms of combat quality. I wouldn't say it's that close, but I can see the potential there. And so in future installments, I hope that they can keep the strong combat as strong as this game and make it even better. Now that was stuff I had played from January to June, and just to note, this is not everything I had played, but this was stuff that I had beaten and I was also interested in talking about. Because I would have done more, but oh my god, this video was like, it's been like 4 hours recording all this shit. It's been so annoying. I don't know, if I do another one of these, I think I might just like script and film stuff as I beat each game, rather than just do it all at once in a big chunk. But anyways, guys, that's it, and have a good day.